Close your eyes now and let the heavy curtains of the present world fall away, leaving you in a quiet candlelit darkness where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and old parchment. Imagine you are standing on the edge of a vast rolling field in northern France, the grass cool and damp against your boots, the sky above a deepening twilight of indigo and bruised purple. The wind here whispers through the ancient oaks, carrying the distant rhythmic clinking of a blacksmith's hammer meeting an anvil, a heartbeat of iron that pulses through the soil. Before we step fully into this river of time, before you settle into the warmth of your blankets, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. Now, breathe in the cool air of the year 1337. We stand at the precipice of a colossal shift, a moment when the world is holding its breath before a century-long exhale of fire and steel. This is the twilight of the feudal age, a time when the map of Europe is not a tidy collection of nations, but a complex shifting mosaic of personal loyalties, family oaths, and ancient obligations, all tied together by the solemn bond between a lord and his vassal. In this era, war is not yet the business of professional standing armies with uniforms and standard-issue boots. It is a personal affair, a summons sent out by a king to his dukes, who summon their counts, who summon their knights, rippling down the social ladder until the farmer leaves his plough to pick up a spear. It is a system built on honour and land, fragile and beautiful in its own chaotic way, like a stained glass window that is constantly being broken and releaded. The undisputed master of this battlefield is the knight, a figure who looms large in our imagination, seated atop a massive warhorse, a destrier that costs as much as a small village. Yet, if we look closely at the knights gathering for this coming storm, we see something slightly different from the gleaming silver statues of Victorian paintings. In the 1330s, the full suit of plate armour, that articulated steel shell we often picture, does not quite exist yet. These men are wrapped in chainmail, thousands of interlinked iron rings, forming a heavy, shimmering mesh called a hauberk, which flows over their padded tunics like a metallic liquid. They wear coats of plates, iron squares riveted inside leather or velvet vests, and their helmets are often the great bassinets with pointed visors, giving them the appearance of steel birds of prey peering through the mist. There is a specific heavy sound to a feudal army on the move, a cacophony of jingling harness bells, the creak of leather saddles, and the dull thud of hooves, lacking the synchronized drum beats of later centuries. It is a colourful, noisy, disorganized parade of heraldry, where every noble sports his own bright colours and coat of arms. Ostensibly so, he can be recognized in the heat of battle, but also, let's be honest, to make sure everyone knows exactly how important he is. It is a bit like a modern red carpet event, only with significantly more lethal weaponry and slightly less comfortable footwear. The philosophy of war here is dictated by the code of chivalry, a set of rules that frames combat as a noble pursuit, a contest of courage between social equals, where capturing a wealthy opponent for ransom is far preferable to killing him. After all, a dead count pays no gold, and the economy of medieval warfare relies heavily on the catch and release of high-value prisoners. However, historians still argue vigorously about how much this code was actually followed when the poets weren't looking, with many suggesting that chivalry was more of a polite suggestion than a hard rule, often discarded the moment a peasant with a billhook got too close. But as we stand here in 1337, staring across the channel toward the island kingdom of England, we can sense that the old ways are about to be shattered. The French army, the largest and wealthiest in Europe, is a magnificent dinosaur, powerful but slow, relying on the shock of the heavy cavalry charge. thousands of tons of horse and man smashing into the enemy line like a living battering ram. It is a tactic that has worked for centuries. Why would they change it? Yet, across the water, King Edward III is brewing something different, something born of necessity and the rough border wars with Scotland. He is gathering men who do not own horses or lands, men who do not have coats of arms or family mottos, men whose hands are calloused not from holding reins, but from gripping the rough, knobby wood of the yew-bow. The tension in the air is palpable, a static charge building between the Valois dynasty in Paris and the Plantagenets in London, a family squabble that has spiralled into a geopolitical crisis because, as anyone with a large extended family knows, the only thing more intense than a war between strangers is a war between cousins who feel they were left out of the will. The stage is being set for a clash that will grind the medieval world into dust and forge the modern one from the ashes. We are watching the sun set on the age of the individual warrior hero. The romance of the lone knight-errant is about to collide with the brutal efficiency of the projectile, the tactical discipline of the infantryman, and the cold mathematics of logistics. But for tonight, the armour still shines, the banners still snap proudly in the wind, and the world is still governed by the oath of the sword. The darkness settles over the camps, the fires are lit, and the soldiers of HistoryForSleep sleep, unaware that they are the last of their kind, unaware that the weapons of the 100 Years' War are about to change the very definitions of courage and cowardice. Focus now on the silence of a deep, ancient forest, specifically the gnarled, twisted form of a yew tree growing in the damp earth of a churchyard, its needles dark green and toxic, its red berries bright against the shadows. From this unassuming poisonous wood comes the instrument that will rewrite the laws of power, the English longbow. It is deceptively simple in appearance, just a 6-foot stave of wood, roughly the height of the man who wields it, lacking the complex gears and levers of the French crossbow. But to hold one is to understand a mastery of natural engineering that borders on the magical. If you were to run your hand along the smooth curve of the bow, you would feel the distinct ridge where two types of wood meet within the single branch, the pale creamy sapwood on the back, which resists tension and stretches without breaking, and the dark reddish heartwood on the belly, which resists compression and pushes back when crushed. It is a natural spring, a battery of kinetic energy waiting to be charged by human muscle. And what muscle it requires. To draw a war bow is not a matter of casual strength. It involves pulling a weight of perhaps 150 pounds. Imagine lifting a grown man off the ground using only 3 fingers of your right hand. This is not a weapon you pick up and learn in a week. It is a weapon you must be grown into like a vine trained along a trellis. The archers of the 100 Years' War begin their training as children, handed miniature bows by their fathers when they are barely strong enough to walk steady, their bodies slowly warped and moulded by the act of drawing the string. If we could look at the skeletons of these men beneath their skin, we would see the evidence of their trade carved into their very bones, thickened left arms, spurs on the shoulder blades, spines twisted slightly by the immense repetitive torque of the draw. They are walking weapon systems, their physiology sacrificed for the singular purpose of launching a heavy shaft of ash or poplar tipped with steel across a quarter of a mile. King Edward III, knowing that the safety of his realm hangs on these bent backs, eventually bans the playing of football and handball, decreeing that all able-bodied men must practice archery on Sundays and holidays, which is perhaps the only time in history a government has successfully tried to stop people from playing sports so they can do more homework, a policy that likely caused no small amount of grumbling in the village taverns. There is a tactile rhythm to the life of the archer, a ritual of beeswax and linen. He must keep his bowstring dry, tucked under his hat or inside his tunic during the wet marches, for a wet string stretches and loses its snap, transforming a lethal weapon into a useless stick. He carries his arrows not in a neat quiver on his back like a movie hero, but often thrust through his belt or stuck into the ground at his feet for rapid access, points down, dirt adding a nasty bacterial bonus to any wound they might inflict. These arrows are the cloth-yard shafts of legend, fledged with the feathers of geese. Thousands of geese, whole flocks plucked bare to feed the hunger of the war machine. At the tip of the arrow sits the bodkin point, a nasty tapering spike of hardened steel designed not to cut wide gashes, but to punch through the resistance of chainmail and padding. Historians still argue fiercely, however, about the true effectiveness of these bodkins against the high-quality plate armour that begins to appear later in the war. Some modern tests suggest the arrows would shatter against a curved steel breastplate, while others argue that at close range, the sheer kinetic energy would be enough to stun a knight, drive fragments of metal into his neck, or at least knock him off his balance and his dignity. Regardless of the physics of penetration, the psychological impact is undeniable. When 1,000 archers draw together, the sound is often described as a sharp intake of breath, a collective gasp of wood bending to its limit. Then comes the release. It is not the twang of a toy, but a deep, resonant thrum, followed by the terrifying, rushing hiss of the arrows tearing through the air. The song of the yew. For the French knights facing this storm, the experience is akin to walking into a horizontal hailstorm, a relentless percussion of impacts that darkens the sky and turns the air itself into a hostile solid. It forces a change in how they must think about bravery. There is no valour in being struck down by an unseen enemy 300 yards away, no glory in falling to a man who does not even know your name. This weapon disrupts the social order as much as the battlefield. It places the power of death into the hands of the lowest commoner, allowing a peasant who smells of turnips and damp wool to strike down a duke whose armour cost more than the peasant's entire village will earn in a generation. The archers themselves are a rowdy, confident breed, aware of their worth. They are not the mindless levies of the past, but semi-professionals who expect to be paid, fed, and occasionally allowed to steal a chicken or two as they march through the French countryside. They march with a distinct lopsided gait, their massive upper bodies contrasting with their agile legs, moving through the muddy lanes of Normandy and Aquitaine with the swagger of men who know they are the king's favourites. Yet, despite their lethal skill, they are vulnerable. A longbowman, without his defensive line, caught in the open by cavalry, is little more than a man with a stick. He relies on the men-at-arms, the wooden stakes he hammers into the ground, and the terrain itself to keep the armoured horses at bay long enough for him to do his work. It is a symbiotic relationship, a dance of protection and projection. As we watch them prepare for the campaigns to come, sitting around campfires sharpening their arrowheads with small whetstones, the sound of metal on stone scratching through the night, we see the dawn of a new kind of tactical discipline. They are checking the fletching, ensuring the goose feathers are glued tight with birch tar, testing the tension of their bowstrings against the damp night air. They are quiet, focused, perhaps sharing a joke about the poor French crossbowmen they expect to meet. Those poor souls with their mechanical cranks and slow reload times who are about to bring a calculator to a gunfight. The longbow is more than a weapon. It is a national identity carved from wood, a symbol of English stubbornness and the democratization of destruction. As the firelight flickers on their faces, you can see the determination that will carry them to the fields of Crécy and beyond. The yew tree in the churchyard has travelled far, and its song is about to be heard across the channel, a melody of tension and release that will echo for 100 years, singing the lullaby of the old world's end. Let the scent of the forest fade now, replaced by the sharp, bracing tang of salt spray and the rhythmic creaking of heavy timber. We are leaving the solid earth behind and stepping onto the undulating deck of a medieval cog, the workhorse ship of the northern seas. It is June 24, 1340, a day that begins with the sun glittering innocently on the waters of the Zwin Inlet, near the bustling port of Sluys in Flanders. The English army is afloat, a strange and precarious sensation for men used to the firmness of soil beneath their boots. King Edward III has assembled a fleet to cross the narrow sea, but what awaits him is not an open voyage, but a floating fortification, a blockade of terrifying scale. As the English ships round the headland, the horizon suddenly sprouts a forest of stripped trees, hundreds of masts huddled together, clogging the estuary like a log jam of giants. This is the great army of the sea, the French fleet, joined by Genoese mercenaries and commanded by admirals who are, unfortunately for them, soldiers first and sailors second. They have arranged their 200 ships in 3 distinct lines, stretching across the mouth of the harbour from bank to bank, a wall of wood intended to bar the English king from landing. In a move that historians still debate, with a mixture of confusion and pity, the French commanders, Cuilleret and Béhuchet, have ordered their ships to be chained together, hull to hull, iron links clanking tight to form a continuous, unyielding platform. Their logic is rooted in the warfare of the land. They are trying to build a castle on the water, a solid rampart where their superior numbers of men-at-arms can hold the line as if they were defending a city wall. It is a magnificent, imposing sight, a floating city of colourful banners and painted hulls, but to the experienced sailors looking on, it looks suspiciously like a trap of their own making. Imagine tying your shoelaces together before a sprint to ensure you don't trip, and you begin to understand the flaw in the plan. The Genoese commander, Barbavera, a man who actually understands that ships are meant to move, pleads with the French to break the chains and fight in the open sea, but he is ignored, his advice dismissed with the arrogance that so often precedes a disaster. The English do not attack immediately. King Edward, standing on the deck of his flagship, the Thomas, watches the tide and the sky with the patience of a predator. He waits for the afternoon, waits until the sun begins its descent in the west and the tide turns in his favour. It is a slow, agonizing wait for the men sitting in the rocking ships, checking their weapons, watching the water lap against the hull, perhaps feeling the rising nausea that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the choppy channel swell. When the order finally comes, it is not a mad rush, but a calculated drift. The English fleet manoeuvres so that the wind fills their sails from behind, and, crucially, the setting sun is at their backs, shining directly into the faces of the French and Genoese crossbowmen. It is a masterstroke of environmental warfare. The enemy is forced to squint into the glare, their vision obscured by the dazzling reflection of light on water, while the English look upon them with perfect clarity. The battle that follows is not a naval engagement in the modern sense with broadsides and skillful sailing. It is a land battle on water, a grinding, chaotic collision of wooden islands. When the English ships crash into the stationary French line, the sound is deafening, the groan of oak, planking shearing under pressure, the snap of oars, the screech of grappling hooks biting into railings. Because the French ships are chained, they cannot manoeuvre, cannot retreat, and cannot help one another. The English are free to isolate parts of the line, swarming over the gunwales like ants attacking a paralysed beetle. The English archers, perched high in the castles, the raised fighting platforms built on the bow and stern of the cogs, rain death down upon the packed French decks. Here, the tragedy of the crossbow versus the longbow plays out again, but this time on a swaying stage. The French crossbowmen, blinded by the sun and crowded by their own countrymen, cannot match the rate of fire coming from the English ships. The arrows fall so thickly that chroniclers later say the air seemed to darken, a twilight brought on by goose feathers. The fighting is brutal and intimate. Men leap across the narrow gaps of churning water, sword and axe in hand, slipping on decks slick with spray and blood. There is nowhere to run. To fall overboard in full armour is a death sentence, a silent plunge into the murky depths of the Swin. The sea, usually a place of vast indifference, becomes a participant in the slaughter. It is said that the water turns so red that the fish drink blood, a grim poetic image that underscores the scale of the carnage. The great French flagship, the Christopher, which had actually been captured from the English years before, is retaken, its French crew cast into the sea, and the English cheer as their own banner is hoisted up the mast once again. A symbolic reclamation that surely boosted morale more than a warm meal. As the sun sets and the stars begin to wheel overhead, the magnitude of the victory becomes clear. The French fleet is not just defeated, it is annihilated. Almost all of the ships are captured or sunk. The two French admirals are captured and executed, a grim end for men who tried to fight the ocean with chains. The news of the disaster is so catastrophic that no one at the French court dares to tell King Philip VI. Finally, the court jester is sent in to break the news, employing a bit of dark reverse psychology. The English are such cowards, the jester remarks casually to the king. Why do you say that? Philip asks, puzzled. Because, the jester replies, with a sad smile, they did not jump into the sea like our brave Frenchmen did. It is a punchline that lands with the weight of 20,000 ghosts. The Battle of Sluys effectively ends the French threat of invading England for the remainder of the war. It secures the Channel as an English moat, allowing Edward to transport his armies, his wool, and his supplies with relative impunity. It is the first great victory, a triumph of tactical patience over static strengths, proving that in this new age of war, flexibility is armour, and rigid tradition is a coffin. The night settles over the Swin, the waters calming as the tide goes out, leaving the wreckage of the wooden walls stranded on the mudflats, a silent testament to the folly of chaining oneself to the past. The English soldiers, exhausted, sleep on the decks of their prizes. The gentle rocking of the waves, now a lullaby of victory, while the moon casts a pale light on the driftwood of an empire that thought it could build a fortress on the shifting sea. The salty air of the Channel is left behind now, replaced by the heavy, humid heat of high summer in the French countryside. It is July 1346, and the golden wheat fields of Normandy are swaying gently under a cerulean sky, blissfully unaware that they are about to become the stage for one of history's most ruthless strategic demonstrations. King Edward III has landed on the beaches of the Cotentin Peninsula, stepping off his ship at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue with the grand theatricality that medieval monarchs seemed to possess in spades. There is a persistent legend, one of those delightful historical echoes, that as Edward stepped onto the sand, he stumbled and fell forward onto his face, a terrifying omen of bad luck to his superstitious soldiers. But Edward, quick-witted, and perhaps remembering that William the Conqueror had done the exact same thing in reverse, when landing in England centuries earlier, reportedly cried out, "I have embraced this land with both arms, and so it is mine." Whether he actually said this, or if it was a clever PR move, invented by a chronicler later on, is a matter for debate, but it certainly set the tone. He was not here to visit, he was here to take. The army that pours out of the ships is not a siege force intending to sit patiently outside castle walls for months. It is a raiding party of massive proportions, designed for speed and destruction. This is the strategy of the chevauchée, a French term that translates simply to a ride, though it implies something far more sinister than a Sunday trot through the park. It is a concept of total war, a scorched earth policy designed to strike at the very heart of the feudal contract. In the medieval mind, a king's primary job, the one-line item in his job description that cannot be ignored, is the protection of his people and their property. By burning the villages, stealing the cattle, and trampling the crops of the French peasantry, Edward is not just inflicting economic damage, he is sending a brutal political message to the French king Philip VI. You cannot stop me, you cannot protect them, therefore you are not truly their king. It is a psychological weapon as much as a military one, a way of hollowing out the enemy's authority from the inside. As the English army begins to move, they spread out into 3 parallel columns, moving eastward like the prongs of a trident. This formation allows them to cover more ground and forage, or rather pillage, more effectively, for an army of 12,000 men and thousands of horses requires a staggering amount of food every single day. The logistics of the time are essentially eat whatever you find, and if you find wine, drink that too. The result of this formation is a swath of destruction nearly 20 miles wide. During the day, the summer sky is stained by 3 distinct trails of thick black smoke, visible for leagues in every direction. It is a terrifying signal, a smudge of charcoal on the horizon that tells every farmer and burgher that the war has come to their doorstep. Yet, within the English ranks, the mood is oddly buoyant. For the common archer and the man-at-arms, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. Normandy is a wealthy province, fat with the profits of the cloth trade and agriculture, and for weeks the soldiers are living better than lords. They are looting silver plate, fine tapestries, and furs. Chroniclers tell us of rough soldiers sleeping on stolen feather beds and drinking vintage wines from silver chalices, a carnival of upside-down social order. There is a strange, dark humour in the accounts of these men, burdened with so much loot that they have to start throwing things away to keep marching. It is the medieval equivalent of having too much luggage for the overhead bin. But amidst the looting, there is a cold strategic mind at work. Edward is drawing Philip out, taunting him, daring him to come and fight. He marches on the rich city of Caen, a cultural jewel of the region. The defence of Caen is a confused affair. The townspeople, brave but untrained, try to hold the bridges. But the English archers and men-at-arms, hardened by years of Scottish border wars, sweep through them with terrifying efficiency. The city is taken, its wealth absorbed into the English baggage train, and the march continues. However, the easy riding soon hits a snag. King Philip is not asleep. He has gathered a massive army, far larger than Edward's, and is shadowing the English, moving parallel to them on the other side of the great River Seine. The bridges have been destroyed or are heavily guarded. Edward is now in a dangerous position. He is deep in enemy territory, his army is laden with loot, and he is trapped between a growing French host and the impassable rivers. The game of cat and mouse intensifies. The English feint toward Paris, sending a shudder of panic through the capital, before swerving north, racing toward the River Somme, looking for a way out. The Somme is a formidable barrier, a wide tidal river that winds through the marshlands, and every bridge is held by the French. The English are running out of food, the bread is mouldy, the wine is gone, and the French army is closing in, nipping at their heels. It is here that we see the importance of local knowledge. A peasant, perhaps coerced, or perhaps bribed with a staggering sum of gold, reveals the existence of a secret ford called Blanchetaque, the white spot, named for the light-coloured stones that are visible through the water at low tide. But there is a catch. It is only passable for a few hours twice a day when the tide is out. When the English arrive at the ford, the tide is high, the water churning and impassable. On the far bank, a force of French soldiers is waiting, commanded by a nobleman named Godemar du Fay. Behind the English, the dust cloud of Philip's main army is rising on the horizon. They are pinned against the water. The tension on the riverbank is breathless. Thousands of men watching the slow, agonizing recession of the water, praying to the moon to hurry its work. As the water level drops, the white stones begin to shimmer beneath the surface. The English vanguard plunges in. It is a surreal battle, fought waist deep in the rushing river. The archers firing volleys, while standing in the water, the men-at-arms splashing forward to clash with the French defenders on the slippery riverbed. The current tugs at their armour, the water turns frothy and red, but the sheer desperation of the English drives them forward. They push the French back, scrambling up the muddy bank on the far side just as the tide begins to turn. In a moment of cinematic timing that no scriptwriter would dare invent, the main French army arrives on the near bank just as the water comes rushing back in. Philip is forced to watch, helpless, as the tide rises like a wall between him and his prey. The English are safe, for the moment shivering and dripping on the northern bank of the Somme, but Edward knows he cannot run forever. He is tired of retreating, tired of the chase. He finds a piece of ground nearby, a sloping field near a forest, close to a small village whose name will soon be etched into history. He decides that he will run no further. He orders his men to stop, to dry their clothes, to check their bowstrings, and to eat and rest. He plants his standard in the earth of a place called Crécy and waits. The fire over Normandy has burned itself out. Now, the thunder is about to begin. The soldiers wrap themselves in their cloaks, listening to the wind in the trees, knowing that tomorrow the looting ends and the killing begins in earnest. The air grows heavy now, charged with the electric scent of ozone and wet grass. It is late afternoon on Saturday, August 26, 1346, and the sky above the field of Crécy-en-Ponthieu has turned a bruised, angry purple. A summer storm breaks with sudden violence, a torrential downpour that soaks the earth and the men standing upon it, turning the dust of the road into a slick, treacherous clay. Thunder rolls across the valley, a deep, guttural growl that seems to shake the very roots of the hills. But look closely at the English lines on the ridge. While the rain lashes down, the archers make a small, almost imperceptible movement. They unstring their bows and tuck the coils of hemp into their helmets or beneath their tunics. It is a simple act of professional housekeeping, keeping the strings dry and taut, while down in the valley, the Genoese mercenaries hired by the French trudge forward with their crossbows exposed to the deluge. Their strings, made of thick gut, soak up the water like thirsty sponges, becoming slack and losing the snap required to punch a bolt through armour. It is a detail of physics that will decide the fate of empires, a reminder that war is often decided not by bravery, but by who remembered to bring an umbrella. As the storm passes, the sun bursts through the clouds in the west, behind the English ridge. It bathes the field in a brilliant golden light, shining directly into the eyes of the advancing French army, dazzling them just as the water did its slides. The stage is set. King Edward III has deployed his men with the care of a master chess player. He has dismounted all his knights and men-at-arms, placing them in solid blocks of steel among the archers. He himself watches from a windmill on the high ground, a silent observer above the fray. The French army, by contrast, is a chaotic river of steel and silk. They have marched all day, hungry and tired, but when the vanguard sees the English waiting, a madness takes hold. King Philip VI tries to order a halt, to camp for the night and fight fresh in the morning. But the order is ignored. The nobles in the rear push forward, terrified that those in the front will win all the glory before they arrive. It is a slow-motion car crash of aristocratic ego, a traffic jam of dukes and counts jostling for position, driven by a code of honour that views caution as cowardice. The Genoese crossbowmen are ordered forward to soften up the English lines. They are exhausted, having marched miles carrying their heavy weapons, and, crucially, they have left their parvises, the large wooden shields they usually hide behind to reload, in the baggage wagons, far to the rear. They are naked in the face of the enemy. They let out 3 great shouts to frighten the English, but the English line remains silent, a stone wall waiting to crumble them. Then a new sound tears through the air. Booming, cracking explosions erupt from the English lines. These are the ribos, early cannons, primitive tubes of iron and wood firing balls of stone or lead. They are small and inaccurate, more like noisy fireworks than modern artillery, but their psychological impact is immense. They are the thunder of Crécy, spitting fire and smoke, spooking the French horses, and announcing that the age of gunpowder has arrived, however clumsily, on the battlefields of Europe. It is a terrifying novelty, a dragon's cough in a world of swords. The Genoese raise their crossbows and fire, but their wet strings betray them. The bolts fall short, harmlessly thudding into the wet turf. In response, the English archers take one step forward. It is a synchronized movement, thousands of boots squelching in the mud. They draw. And then the sky vanishes. The chronicler Jean Froissart describes the English arrows falling like snow, a relentless, white-fletched blizzard that hisses through the air. The Genoese are decimated. Unlike the slow clack-wind clack of the crossbow, the longbows deliver a continuous stream of missiles, 6 to 10 per minute per man. The mercenaries, panicked and broken, turn to run. What happens next is the tragedy of the feudal mind laid bare. The French knights, seeing their own mercenaries retreat, do not see a tactical withdrawal. They see treason. "Kill me, these rascals," King Philip reportedly cries out, "for they block our path and are useless." The French cavalry charges through their own fleeing allies, trampling the Genoese into the mud in their eagerness to get to the English. It is a horrific scene of fratricide, a grinding collision of horse and flesh that stalls the charge before it even reaches the enemy. And all the while, the snowstorm of arrows continues. The arrows do not just kill men, they madden the horses. A destrier, struck in the flank or neck, becomes a bucking, uncontrollable beast, throwing its rider or trampling the men around it. The pristine French formation dissolves into a writhing pile of mud, blood, and screaming animals. The English men at arms, standing firm on foot, step forward only to finish off those who manage to stumble through the arrow storm, using their short spears and swords to dispatch the fallen with grim efficiency. There is a moment of mythic resonance in the centre of the line, where the king's 16-year-old son, Edward, the Black Prince, is fighting. The French press him hard, sensing a high-value prize. A messenger races to the windmill, pleading with King Edward to send reinforcements. The king, watching the battle unfold with an unnerving calm, asks simply, "Is my son dead, or unhorsed, or so wounded he cannot help himself?" When the messenger says no, the king replies, "Then let the boy win his spurs." It is a famous line, perhaps apocryphal, but it captures the brutal parenting style of the Plantagenets. The crucible of battle is the only classroom that matters. The prince survives, his reputation forged in the cold mud of Crécy. But there is another figure on the field who captures the tragic romance of the day, King John of Bohemia. He is blind, an old warrior who can no longer see the enemy, but refuses to miss the battle. He orders his knights to tie their horses' reins to his, so they can guide him into the thick of the fighting, that he might strike one blow for France. They ride into the dark storm together, a chain of loyalty and doomed bravery. The next morning, they are found still tied together, all dead, the blind king in the centre of his fallen friends, a poignant monument to a chivalric ideal that is dying on this very field. As night falls, the fighting does not end so much as it suffocates in the dark. The French launch charge after charge, 15 or 16 in total, each one breaking against the English position like waves against a cliff. The flower of French nobility is cut down not by knightly equals, but by yeomen farmers and Welsh knifemen. By midnight, the silence that settles over Crécy is heavy and terrible. King Philip, wounded and with only a handful of attendants left, flees into the darkness, knocking on the door of a castle late at night, crying, "Open! It is the fortune of France." The English sleep where they fought, surrounded by the carnage, too exhausted to pursue. They have lost perhaps a few hundred men. The French have lost thousands, including dukes, counts, and a king. The Battle of Crécy is a shock to the system of Europe. It proves that the mounted knight, the undisputed master of warfare for centuries, can be stopped. It proves that a disciplined combined arms force of infantry and archers is superior to a disorganized mob of individual heroes. The thunder of the cannons was a novelty, but the true thunder was the collapse of an era. The feudal host lies broken in the mud, and the modern army begins to rise from its grave. Sleep now, knowing that even the mightiest storms eventually give way to silence, and that history turns on the smallest of hinges, a wet string, a hidden ford, and the courage to stand one's ground when the world gallops toward you. The thunder of the battlefield fades, not into the peaceful silence of rest, but into a strange, suffocating stillness that creeps across the continent like a sea fog. We move forward now, just a few short years from the triumph of Crécy to 1347 and 1348. The war has paused, not by the signing of a treaty, but because a new conqueror has arrived, one that wears no armour, carries no banner, and acknowledges no king. It enters Europe through the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, carried in the bellies of Genoese trading ships that drift into harbour with crews who are mostly dead or dying. They bring with them spices, silks, and an invisible stowaway, Yersinia pestis, the great mortality, the pale horseman. It is a biological invasion that will claim more lives in 5 years than the 100 Years' War will claim in its entire century-long span. The conflict between England and France, previously the most consuming event in the lives of these people, is suddenly rendered petty and small, shrinking against the backdrop of an apocalypse that kills indiscriminately. It does not matter if you are a Plantagenet or a Valois, a longbowman or a knight, the bacteria strikes with a terrifying equality. In the villages of France and the hamlets of England, the noise of the blacksmith's hammer and the fletcher's knife falls silent. The war effort grinds to a halt, because, quite simply, there are not enough men left to hold the spears. Imagine walking through a village in Normandy during this time. The air is heavy with the scent of burning juniper and rosemary, herbs thrown onto fires in a desperate, superstitious attempt to scrub the miasma, the bad air, from the streets. The doors of cottages are marked with white crosses. The church bells ring constantly, a ceaseless tolling dirge, until the bell ringers themselves fall ill, and a heavy silence descends. In some regions, a third, perhaps even half of the population vanishes. The fields go unploughed, the harvest rots on the vine, and the cattle roam wild, their lowing the only sound in the empty valleys. For the armies locked in their dynastic struggle, this is a logistical nightmare. Campaigns are abandoned, sieges are lifted, not by relieving armies, but by the invisible hand of sickness. In 1348, the English army is effectively dissolved by the plague, the soldiers sent home to die in their own beds or to find their families already gone. It is a moment where history holds its breath, where the very fabric of society threatens to unravel completely. Yet, in the wake of this devastation, a profound shift occurs, one that will ironically fuel the fires of war for decades to come. It is a grim lesson in economics. When something becomes rare, it becomes valuable, and suddenly human beings are very, very rare. For centuries, the peasant, the foot soldier, and the archer were considered disposable, easily replaced by the next son in the next village. But now, the village is empty. The lord who once looked down on his tenants from the high window of his keep now finds that he cannot harvest his crops or defend his walls without them. The surviving men realize their worth. A ploughman who survived the plague can now demand wages 3 times what his father earned. And the soldier? The soldier becomes a prized commodity. The English kings and French dukes can no longer simply snap their fingers and expect a levy of thousands to appear. They must pay, and they must pay well. This accelerates the transition we witnessed at Crécy, the move from a feudal levy based on duty to a professional contract army based on cash. The indenture system becomes the standard. A captain signs a contract with the king to provide a certain number of archers and men-at-arms for a specific price and period. War becomes a business, a career path for the ambitious survivor. The psychology of the soldier changes too. Having looked the Black Death in the eye and blinked, the survivors possess a certain fatalistic fearlessness. Why fear a French sword or an English arrow when you have already walked through the valley of the shadow of death? A distinct live for today mentality permeates the ranks. If life is short and can be snuffed out by a flea bite, then one might as well live boldly, fight hard, and spend the king's gold on fine wine and velvet while the blood is still warm in your veins. This era sees the rise of a new kind of military fashion, gaudy, extravagant, and defiant. Soldiers begin to wear their wealth, donning silks and furs that were once restricted to the nobility by sumptuary laws. After all, who is going to arrest a man for dressing above his station when the sheriff is dead and the judge is in the grave? The lines between the classes, once rigid stone walls, become porous hedges. Historians still argue about the long-term military effects of the plague, debating whether it ultimately weakened the monarchies by draining their treasuries or strengthened them by forcing the creation of more efficient tax systems to pay these expensive new soldiers. What is certain is that the war did not end. It merely mutated. The armies that reassemble in the 1350s are smaller, leaner, and more vicious. They are composed of men who are immune, both biologically to the disease and emotionally to the horrors of death. The sheer scale of the mortality created a vacuum that violence rushed to fill. We see the emergence of a darker, more predatory form of warfare, driven not just by dynastic claims but by the need to feed and pay these professional companies. The King of France and the King of England are no longer just fighting for a crown. They are fighting to control the monster they have created, a military machine that requires constant fuel in the form of plunder and pay. As the plague recedes, retreating into the endemic shadows where it will lurk for centuries, it leaves behind a Europe that is scarred but strangely energized. The pale horseman has ridden through the ranks, culling the weak and hardening the strong. The survivors look around at the empty world and see opportunity. The longbows are restrung. The armour is polished, though now it is often inherited armour, taken from a dead uncle or brother, and the banners are unfurled once more. The war resumes, but the innocence, if there ever was any, is gone. The men marching to the next campaign carry with them the silent knowledge of the grave. They fight with the reckless abandon of those who know they are living on borrowed time. The silence of the village churchyard is replaced by the tramp of boots as the armies of the resurrection march toward Poitiers. The moon hangs high and white over the empty fields, a ghostly witness to the resilience of human aggression. We are moving toward a clash where a prince dressed in black armour will face a king in golden lilies, a battle that will prove that while the plague can kill a body, it cannot kill the human desire for glory, however fleeting it may be. The heat of the French summer lingers into September 1356, baking the vineyards of Aquitaine until the air shimmers above the vines. We find ourselves following the banners of Edward of Woodstock, the man history will remember as the Black Prince, though in his own time he was simply known as the Prince, a title that needed no qualification. He is 26 years old now, a warrior in his prime, with a reputation that terrifies the French populace and inspires a fanatical devotion in his own men. He has been busy conducting another chevauchée, a grand destructive tour through the heart of France, burning, looting, and generally making a nuisance of himself in the way only a medieval prince can. But this time the cat has caught the mouse. King John II of France, known as Jean le Bon or John the Good, a nickname that refers more to his bravery and generosity than his strategic acumen, has outmanoeuvred the prince. He has cut off the English retreat to Bordeaux. The English army is tired, outnumbered, and heavily laden with wagons full of stolen tablecloths and candlesticks. They are trapped near the city of Poitiers, on a piece of uneven ground crisscrossed by hedges and vines, a terrain that a farmer would call difficult and a soldier would call a nightmare. It is here that the prince decides to make his stand. The night before, the battle is tense. A cardinal, Talleyrand de Périgord, rides frantically between the two camps, trying to negotiate a truce to avoid the shedding of Christian blood. The prince, realizing his precarious position, actually offers to give back all the loot, release his prisoners, and promise not to fight France for 7 years, a deal so good it sounds like a desperate clearance sale. But King John, confident in his overwhelming numbers and perhaps eager to crush the pest that has been tormenting his kingdom, refuses. He demands the prince surrender unconditionally. The prince, whose pride is as thick as his armour, politely declines. The talking is over. Sunday, September 19th, dawns cool and bright. The English have taken up a defensive position on a slope, using the thick hedges and vineyards to break up the enemy's formation, a tactical callback to Crécy, but adapted for the enclosed terrain of Poitiers. The French, however, believe they have learned the lesson of Crécy. They remember the horses maddened by arrows, the chaos of the stampede. So, the French commanders make a decision that historians still argue about with a mixture of fascination and bafflement. They order their knights to dismount. They trim their lances down to 5 feet to use as spears, take off their spurs so they don't trip, and prepare to walk into battle. It is a logical overcorrection, like deciding to walk to work because your car had a flat tire once. The idea is to present a solid wall of steel that the arrows cannot panic, but they forget one crucial detail. Plate armor is heavy. Walking a mile in full harness through muddy vineyards and soft soil under the sun is exhausting before a single blow is struck. They are effectively marching themselves into exhaustion. The battle begins with a small, brave, and ultimately foolish charge of mounted French knights, a forlorn hope sent to smash the English archers. They are funneled into a narrow lane by the hedges, where they become easy targets. The English archers, safely behind the vegetation, shoot not at the armoured men, but at the unarmoured horses. The lane becomes a choked abattoir of falling beasts and trapped knights. The 1st French Division, seeing this disaster, recoils. Then comes the main event. The dismounted French knights begin their slow, clanking trudge up the hill. It is a spectacle of grim determination. Thousands of noblemen, the elite of France, wading through the vines, their breath fogging their visors, their boots sinking into the earth. As they approach, the English archers loose their volleys. But here The technology of defence has improved. The French armour is better now than it was 10 years ago. More plate, less mail. Many arrows glance off the curved steel breastplates. The French roar as they reach the English line, and the battle descends into a brutal, grinding melee of axe, sword, and hammer. It is a brawl in a vineyard, devoid of glamour, a claustrophobic crush of metal on metal. The Black Prince is in the thick of it, fighting alongside his men, his presence acting as a living banner. The English line wavers, bends, but holds. Then, a stroke of genius, or perhaps luck. The Prince sends a small cavalry force, the Captal de Buch, to ride around the flank and strike the French from behind. At the same time, the English men-at-arms mount their own horses and charge down the hill. Caught between the hammer and the anvil, the French army disintegrates. In the centre of the collapse stands King John. To his credit, he does not run. He stands with a massive battle axe, swinging it with a ferocity that clears a circle around him. At his side is his 14-year-old son, Philip. The boy, too young to fight effectively, but brave enough to stay, calls out warnings to his father in the chaos. "Father, guard to the right. Father, guard to the left." It is a touching, terrified duet amidst the slaughter. A father and son back to back against the world. But they are swarmed. The desire to kill the king is outweighed by the desire to capture him. After all, he is the ultimate winning lottery ticket. A mob of English and Gascon soldiers surrounds him, shouting, "Yield! Yield!" in a dozen dialects, grabbing at his surcoat, arguing over who actually caught him. It is an undignified scrum, like shoppers fighting over the last television on Black Friday. Finally, a banished French knight, fighting for the English, pushes through and takes the king's surrender. The king is led away, battered but alive, a prisoner of the English crown. That evening, a scene plays out that perfectly encapsulates the strange, schizophrenic nature of medieval warfare. The Black Prince hosts a supper in his tent for the captured King John. The prince, the victor, refuses to sit at the table. Instead, he serves the king personally, pouring his wine and cutting his meat. Bowing and speaking with humble deference, he praises the king's bravery, calling him the prize of the day, and assures him he will be treated with honour. It is the height of chivalry, a performance of mutual respect between aristocrats who have more in common with each other than with the peasants lying dead outside in the dark. It is a beautiful, civilized moment, but it sits awkwardly against the reality of the thousands of corpses cooling in the vineyards, men who will have no royal supper and whose families will receive no ransom. The capture of King John is a catastrophe for France. The head of the state has been severed. The government in Paris is paralysed. The ransom demanded for his release is astronomical. 3 million gold écus, a sum so large it is theoretically impossible to pay without bankrupting the nation twice over. France is left leaderless, defeated, and humiliated. As the English army marches slowly toward Bordeaux with their royal prize, the French countryside falls silent, stunned by the impossible. The king is gone. The knights are dead or captured. The shield of the realm has been shattered. And in the shadows of this power vacuum, something dangerous begins to stir. The soldiers who were hired to fight are now unemployed, far from home, and very, very armed. The war of kings is pausing, but the war of the wolves is about to begin. Sleep well, knowing that even in defeat there is dignity to be found, and that sometimes the heaviest burden a person can carry is not armour, but a crown. The silence following the capture of King John is deceptive, a breath held before a scream. We find ourselves now in the strange twilight years following the Battle of Poitiers, a period that history books often label as a truce. But for the people living in the rolling hills of Burgundy, the fertile plains of the Languedoc, and the river valleys of the Loire, there is no peace. There is only a terrifying new reality, a plague not of bacteria, but of iron and greed. The war between the crowns has officially paused, the great armies disbanded, and the kings have withdrawn to their palaces to haggle over ransoms and treaties. But the soldiers, the thousands of English, Welsh, Gascon, German, and Breton mercenaries who were hired to fight, do not simply vanish. They are men with a very specific set of skills that involve swinging a sword and riding a horse, and they are suddenly unemployed in a foreign land. They have no desire to return to the mud of an English farm or the poverty of a German hamlet. So they stay, they organise, they form what are known as the free companies, or in the darker whispers of the French peasantry, the routiers. They are wolves who have slipped the leash of their masters, roaming the countryside in packs that range from a few dozen desperate men to organised armies of several thousand. Imagine the sinking feeling in your stomach if you were a village elder in the 1360s, standing on the village green and seeing a cloud of dust rising on the horizon. It is not the banner of the King of France, which would mean taxes, nor the banner of the King of England, which would mean war. It is something worse, a banner of black or red, perhaps bearing a skull or a nonsensical motto, signalling the arrival of men who acknowledge no law but their own appetite. These companies operate like mobile corporations of violence. They have captains, treasurers, and secretaries. They are democratic in a perverse way. The loot is shared according to strict contracts, and leaders are often elected based on their ability to find the richest targets. Their tactic is not the open battle, but the partis, a system of organised extortion that would make a modern mob boss nod in appreciation. They capture a small castle or a fortified mill, turn it into their headquarters, and then send polite, terrifying letters to the surrounding villages and towns. Pay us, the letters say, and we will not burn your crops, steal your cattle, or kill your families. We will even protect you from other companies. It is a protection racket on a national scale. The Great Company, a massive amalgamation of these bands formed in 1360, becomes so powerful that it threatens the Pope himself in his palace at Avignon. The pontiff, terrified of these unholy warriors, ends up paying them a massive bribe and giving them a blessing to go away, essentially paying them to go sin somewhere else, which suggests that even divine intervention has a price tag during the 100 Years' War. The weaponry and tactics of the free companies are a hodgepodge of the best and worst of the era. Because they are professional soldiers with no uniform code, they wear whatever they can steal or buy. A captain might wear a suit of Italian plate armour worth a fortune, while his lieutenant wears a brigandine covered in green velvet. They are masters of the surprise attack, the night raid, and the ambush. They do not fight for territory or honour, they fight for profit. This makes them incredibly dangerous because they do not take unnecessary risks. They will not charge a hill if they can starve the defenders out. They will not fight to the last man if they can negotiate a surrender. Historians still argue about the long-term impact of these companies on the development of warfare. Some suggest they were a retarding force, a chaotic element that prevented the development of stable states. Others argue they were the crucible of modern military professionalism, the first true career soldiers who proved that war could be a self-sustaining industry, independent of feudal obligation. They are the ancestors of the modern private military contractor, though with significantly better hats and worse dental hygiene. One of the most famous, or infamous, of these captains is Sir John Hawkwood, an Englishman who began his career as a humble longbowman and rose to become one of the wealthiest and most feared mercenary commanders in Europe. The Italians call him Giovanni Acuto, John the Sharp, a fitting name for a man who treats war like a game of chess played with real lives. He is a pragmatic, cold professional who switches sides whenever the contract expires, fighting for the Pope 1 month and against him the next, always with the same terrifying competence. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal, but telling, that 2 friars once greeted Hawkwood with the traditional blessing, "God give you peace." Hawkwood stared at them and replied, "And God take away your arms." Yo. When the confused friars asked why he said such a thing, he replied, "Do you not know that I live by war and that peace would be my undoing?" It is a moment of dry, dark humour that reveals the soul of the mercenary. Peace is bad for business. The psychological toll on the French population is immense. The Wolf of Badenoch and the Archpriest, a mercenary leader who was actually a clergyman, proving that a collar doesn't prevent one from being a cutthroat, become boogeymen used to frighten children. The countryside becomes a patchwork of danger zones where no one travels without an armed escort. The economy collapses in many regions because trade is impossible when every road has a toll booth manned by a man with a heavy axe. Yet in this chaos there is a strange evolution. The villagers begin to fortify themselves. Churches are built with thick walls and arrow slits, turning the house of God into a house of defence. The peasantry, abandoned by their nobility, begin to look to their own protection, forming local militias to fight off the smaller bands of brigands. It is a hardening of society, a scar tissue forming over the wound. The free companies also force a change in the way armies are raised. Kings realise that they cannot simply disband an army and hope the soldiers go home. They begin to understand that a standing army, paid even in peacetime, might be cheaper than the devastation caused by unemployed soldiers destroying the tax base. As the sun sets over a ruined watchtower in the Dordogne, occupied by a company of Gascon and English adventurers roasting a stolen pig over a fire, we see the dark underbelly of the chivalric age. These men in Ornum are not the knights of Arthurian legend. They are the working-class grinders of war, the men who know that a sword is just a tool and a castle is just a bank vault waiting to be cracked. They laugh and gamble with dice made of bone, their faces scarred and weather-beaten, living fully in the moment because they know the next contract might be their last. The peace of Bretigny has brought no peace, only a privatisation of the war that makes it more personal, more random, and more terrifying. The wolves are in the fold, and the shepherd is in chains. But as the iron grip of the companies tightens, another change is happening in the forges of Milan and Germany. If the world is full of wolves, then the sheep must grow iron skin. The era of chainmail is ending, and the age of the white harness, the full plate armour that turns a man into a living statue, is about to dawn. Sleep now, safe in your bed, far from the sound of hoofbeats in the night and the demand for parties. And be grateful that the only wolves you face are in the realm of dreams. Step out of the cool, dangerous moonlight of the countryside and into the intense, rhythmic warmth of a master armourer's workshop. The air here is thick and dry, tasting of coal dust and red-hot iron, a sharp metallic tang that coats the back of the throat. It is a place of transformation, where the elements of the earth are beaten into a second skin. We are in the late 14th century now, perhaps in the bustling streets of Milan or the disciplined guild halls of Augsburg, the twin capitals of the armour-making world. The soundscape is a relentless musical percussion. The high-pitched ping of a small hammer shaping a gauntlet, the deep, dull thud of a sledge flattening a billet of steel, and the hissing sigh of glowing metal plunged into a trough of oil. This is the laboratory where the knight is being reinvented. For centuries, the warrior relied on chainmail, that heavy fluid mesh of riveted rings we saw at the war's beginning. But the longbow and the crossbow have changed the calculus of survival. A bodkin point, driven by 100-pound draw weight, can burst the links of mail and drive the broken iron into the flesh beneath. A lesson learned in blood at Crécy and Poitiers. The aristocracy of Europe, unwilling to be harvested like corn by peasant archers, demands a solution. They demand a shell that is impervious, a surface so hard and smooth that death will simply slide off it. And so, the age of the white harness, full-plate armour, begins to gleam in the firelight. This evolution is not a sudden leap, but a slow, desperate creeping of steel across the body. It begins with the coat of plates, iron squares riveted inside a leather vest, hidden away like a secret. Then, the steel grows bold. It emerges to cover the shins, then the arms, and finally, the chest. By the early 1400s, the transformation is complete. The knight is no longer a man in a metal shirt. He is a man encased in a sculpture. Consider the sheer artistry required to forge a breastplate. It is not cast in a mould like a toy soldier. It is hammered from a single flat sheet of metal. The armourer must coax the steel into a complex organic curve that mimics the human chest, but improves upon it, creating a glancing surface. This is a crucial concept in medieval physics. If an arrow or a sword strikes a flat surface, it transfers all its energy into the blow. But if it strikes a curve, it skids away, its energy dissipated harmlessly into the air. The armour is designed to reject violence. A master armourer does not just build protection, he builds a geometry of deflection. There is a persistent heavy myth that we must gently set aside here, the image of the knight as a clumsy, lumbering robot, a turtle on two legs who, if knocked over, would flail helplessly like a beetle on its back. This is a Victorian invention, a caricature born of latter, heavier tournament armour. The reality of 15th century war armour is a revelation of engineering. A full suit weighs perhaps 45 to 55 pounds, actually less than the combat load of a modern infantryman in full kit. But the magic lies in the distribution. A modern soldier carries the weight on his shoulders in a backpack, straining the spine. The knight wears his weight. It is distributed across the whole body, each piece strapped to the limb it protects. A knight in a well-fitted Milanese harness can run, jump, climb a ladder, and yes, even do a cartwheel, though one imagines the dignity of a duke might prevent him from doing so often. The articulation, the way the steel plates slide over one another at the joints, connected by sliding rivets and leather straps, is so smooth it mimics the natural movement of the human skeleton. It is not a cage. It is an exoskeleton of power. When a knight moves, he does not clank like a bag of pots. He makes a soft sliding sound, a whisper of steel on steel, like a glacier shifting in the night. However, this perfection comes at a cost, and not just in gold. To be inside the suit is to inhabit a private, enclosed world. Put on the helmet, the bassinet, which has evolved from a simple skull cap into a tall, conical dome designed to deflect downward blows. Now, lower the visor, the world suddenly shrinks. Your peripheral vision is gone. You can see only what is directly in front of you through a narrow horizontal slit, the ocularium. The sounds of the battlefield become muffled and strange, filtered through layers of steel and padding. You hear your own breathing, loud and raspy, echoing in the metal chamber. You smell the oil of the armour, the sweat of your own body, and the leather of the liner. It is a sensory deprivation tank built for war. This isolation creates a unique psychological state. You feel invincible, separated from the vulnerability of the flesh, yet you are also cut off from the humanity of the chaotic world outside. You are a tank before the invention of engines. The visor itself deserves a moment of attention. In this period, the fashion and function dictates a shape known as the hound skull, or hound's skull, though the soldiers, with their earthy humour, often call it the pig-faced bassinet. It protrudes forward in a pointed snout, giving the knight the appearance of a terrifying steel bird or beast. This is not for aesthetic horror, though it certainly helps. The pointed snout acts as a ramp, forcing any arrow or lance that strikes the face to slide off to the side, rather than smashing into the flat of the nose. It is ugly, yes, but in a world of flying steel, ugly is alive. Historians and armour experts still debate the precise effectiveness of these visors against the heaviest crossbow bolts, noting that while the shape was perfect for deflection, the vision slits remained a deadly weak point, a tiny window of vulnerability that an archer with the devil's own luck might find. This white harness creates a profound social divide on the battlefield. The gap between the rich and the poor has always existed, but now it is measured in metallurgy. A wealthy noble in a custom-made suit of hardened, tempered steel is almost immune to the casual violence of the battlefield. He can wade through a crowd of poorly armed peasants like a god, their weapons ringing harmlessly off his pauldrons and cowders. He can only be stopped by something massive, a poleaxe, a warhammer, or a cannonball. Meanwhile, the common soldier, wearing perhaps a padded jack or a rusty mail shirt, is vulnerable to every stray splinter of war. The armour turns the noble body into a fortress, increasing the value of the man inside by ensuring he survives long enough to be ransomed. Yet there is a soft human vulnerability hidden beneath the plates. Imagine the itch you cannot scratch, trapped under layers of linen and steel. Imagine the heat of a French summer day, turning the suit into a slow cooking oven. The knight relies entirely on his squire, not just for status but for survival. He cannot put this armour on alone, nor can he easily take it off. He is bound to another man by buckles and laces, a relationship of intimate trust. If the squire fails to tighten a strap, the armour fails. If the squire flees, the knight is trapped in his shell. As we leave the workshop, watching the armourer polish a greave until it shines like a mirror, reflecting the flames of the forge, we realise that the sword is losing its primacy. You cannot cut a man in plate armour. You must crush him, pierce him, or wrestle him to the ground and find the gaps. The elegance of the sword fight is giving way to the brutality of the can opener. The armour has reached its zenith, a masterpiece of form and function that defines the aesthetic of the late Middle Ages. But as always in the history of war, for every shield there is a breaker. The walls of the castle and the walls of the suit are about to face a new kind of hunger, one that does not care for the deflection of steel, but for the crushing weight of stone and the slow, gnawing emptiness of the belly. The knight is safe in his steel skin, but he is about to learn that you cannot wear armour against starvation. Leave the heat of the forge now, and step into the long, cold shadow of a high stone wall. The air here is still, stagnant, smelling of wet earth, wood smoke, and the sour decay of a camp that has sat in one place for too long. We've moved from the lightning-fast raids of the chevauchée and the thunderous collision of open battle to the slow, grinding reality that consumes most of the 100 Years' War, the siege. In the movies, war is a series of charges and sword fights. In reality, war in the 14th century is mostly a staring contest between a man inside a castle and a man outside it, both wondering who will run out of food first. We are standing outside the walls of a place like Calais, or perhaps Harfleur, where the English army has settled in like an unwanted house guest who refuses to take a hint. The castle ahead is a masterpiece of defensive architecture, a stone giant with concentric walls, round towers that deflect missiles, and a deep moat that reflects the grey sky. It is built to say no, and for the army outside, the challenge is how to turn that no into a yes using physics, patience, and cruelty. The most spectacular way to argue with a castle is, of course, the trebuchet. Picture a machine that looks like a skeletal dinosaur made of oak beams, towering 50 feet into the air. It is a gravity-powered catapult, a triumph of medieval engineering that uses a massive counterweight, a box filled with tons of earth, lead or stones, to whip a long throwing arm into the sky. The sound of a trebuchet is distinct, a low, groaning creak as the winch drags the arm down, the frantic shouting of the crew, and then the terrifying whoosh of release. It does not bark like a cannon. It sighs, a giant exhalation that sends a rock the size of a beer barrel arcing gracefully through the air. For those inside the walls, the arrival of the stone is a sudden, shattering violence. It smashes through slate roofs, crushes timber floors, and pulses a shockwave through the masonry that rattles the teeth. But the trebuchet is not just for stones. In a grim display of psychological and biological warfare, besieging armies sometimes load the sling with dead horses, cows, or even the bodies of plague victims, hurling them so over the walls to spread disease and despair. It is a macabre delivery service, a message that says, "Rot with us." Yet for all their drama, trebuchets are slow and labour-intensive. It takes hours to set up, minutes to reload, and a single lucky shot from a defender's ballista can disable the mechanism. More fearful than the assault from the sky is the assault from below. Mining is the invisible terror of the siege, while the archers trade insults with the guards on the battlements to keep them distracted. A team of sappers is digging quietly beneath the earth, tunneling like moles toward the foundations of the walls. These men work in cramping darkness, shoring up their tunnel with wooden props as they go. Their goal is not to break into the castle, but to break the castle itself. When they reach the critical point under a tower, they pack the tunnel with brushwood, straw, and, crucially, pig fat. This is where the history of warfare takes a culinary turn. Records from the time show royal orders for vast quantities of bacon and lard, not for the soldiers' breakfast, but to ensure a hot, greasy fire. When the mine is lit, the wooden props burn away and the tunnel collapses, bringing the unsuspecting tower crashing down into the moat. Historians still argue about the frequency of successful mining operations, noting that defenders often dug counter-mines to intercept the tunnellers, leading to ferocious, claustrophobic knife fights in the pitch-black dark, 50 feet underground, where the only light was a flickering candle, and the only air was the breath of your enemy. It is a form of combat so intimate and terrifying that it makes the open battlefield look like a playground. But the most effective weapon of all is neither the stone giant nor the hidden mine. It is hunger. A siege is fundamentally a mathematical equation. Calories divided by people equals time. The besieging commander knows that if he can just seal the exits, the castle will eventually fall without the loss of a single one of his soldiers. He builds a circumvallation, a wall of his own around the castle, to ensure nothing goes in or out. Inside, the food stocks dwindle. The fine wine is drunk, then the sour beer, then the water from the rain barrels. The roast beef gives way to salted pork, then to bread made from oats, then to stewed leather boots, and finally to the rats that scurry in the cellars. It is a slow, agonizing slide into desperation. This leads to one of the most heart-wrenching tragedies of medieval warfare: the expulsion of the bouches, inutiles, the useless mouths. When the food runs low, the castle commander faces a brutal choice. To save his garrison, the soldiers who can fight, he must eject the women, children, the elderly, and the sick. They are pushed out of the gates, hoping the besieging army will let them pass, but often the besieger refuses wanting to keep the pressure on the garrison's food supply, or simply unwilling to feed extra mouths himself. These poor souls are trapped in the no man's land between the wall and the enemy trench, starving to death in plain view of their fathers and husbands on the ramparts. It is a horror that stains the soul of chivalry, a reminder that the honourable laws of war often evaporate when the stomach is empty. The siege of Calais, which lasted for nearly a year from 1346 to 1347, is the perfect stage for this grim drama. King Edward III sits outside the city, stubborn as the stone he faces. He builds a temporary town called Villeneuve-la-Hardie, Newtown the Bold, complete with a marketplace, confirming the English tendency to insist on home comforts wherever they go, even while starving their neighbours. Inside Calais, the people eat dogs and horses. When the city finally surrenders, Edward is furious at their resistance. He demands that 6 of the city's leading citizens, the burghers, walk out to him, wearing halters around their necks, carrying the keys to the city, ready to be executed. It is a piece of calculated theatre designed to humiliate the merchant class. They walk out, emaciated and weeping, expecting death. The king calls for the executioner, but then his queen, Philippa of Hainault, heavily pregnant and likely tired of her husband's tantrums, throws herself on her knees. She begs for their lives, arguing that killing them would be a bad omen for her unborn child. Edward, grumbling like a man who has been told he can't watch his favourite show, relents. "Lady," he says, "I wish you were anywhere but here. You entreat so tenderly that I cannot refuse you." The burghers are spared. It is a rare moment of mercy in a merciless century, a flash of light in the grey monotony of the blockade. As the seasons turn and the leaves fall from the trees around the siege camp, the reality of this warfare sinks in. It is a test of will, a slow erosion of spirit. The soldiers outside are bored, gambling away their future pay, dying of dysentery in the muddy ditches. The soldiers inside are ghosts, haunting their own battlements, watching the horizon for a relief army that never comes. The stone giants stand silent against the twilight, their work done or their failure absolute. The walls may still stand, scratched and battered, but the people inside are broken. We leave them there in the quiet aftermath of surrender, where the silence is broken only by the creaking of the gate, opening for the first time in months, allowing the victors to march in and claim a city of skeletons. The war is changing again. The static strength of the castle is being challenged, not just by stones, but by the shifting sands of strategy. For in the shadows of Brittany, a new kind of commander is watching, one who realizes that the best way to win a siege is to never let the enemy sit down in the first place. The heavy static silence of the siege camp dissolves now, replaced by the rustle of leaves in a dense, misty forest. We are moving away from the great stone walls and into the shadows of the countryside, deep into the briar patches and hidden valleys of Brittany and the Ile-de-France. The year is moving into the 1370s, and the war has changed its rhythm again. The English, confident after their great victories, are marching through France like lions, roaring for a fight, their banners unfurled, their archers ready to darken the sky once more. But the fields are empty. The hills are silent. There is no one to fight. The French army has vanished, not into defeat, but into the landscape itself. This is the handiwork of a man who looks nothing like the heroes in the illuminated manuscripts. Close your eyes and picture a knight. You likely see a tall, blonde figure with a square jaw and angelic features, a Lancelot come to life. Now erase that image completely. In its place, visualize Bertrand du Guesclin. He is short, squat, and incredibly broad-shouldered, with a face that chroniclers politely describe as swarthy, and less politely describe as resembling a wild boar. Even as a child he was so pugnacious and ugly that his own mother made him eat at a separate table from his brothers. He is the eagle of Brittany, the black dog of Broceliande, a man who rose not through royal favour or elegant jousting, but through the brutal, mud-stained meritocracy of the border wars. He is the first constable of France, who is not a great duke, but a minor noble who treats war not as a theatre of honour, but as a job that needs to be done, and he knows exactly how to do it. Du Guesclin looks at the English military machine, that terrifying combination of longbows and dismounted knights, and he realises a simple cold truth. If we play by their rules, we lose. The English want a battle. They want another Crécy, another Poitiers, where they can stand on a hill and destroy the French nobility. So, Du Guesclin decides to break the game. He forbids his commanders to engage in pitched battles. Let them march, he says. Let them walk until their boots rot and their horses die. He adopts what historians later call a Fabian strategy, named after the Roman general who defeated Hannibal by refusing to fight him. But to the English, it feels less like history and more like a nightmare. The great English armies, led by figures like John of Gaunt, march out in grand chevauchés, expecting to burn and pillage their way to glory. Instead, they find a wasteland. Du Guesclin has ordered the peasants to bring all their food and livestock into the fortified towns. He burns the bridges, he poisons the wells, he destroys the mills. The English march through a silence that is absolute and starving. They are dressed for a duel, but they are fighting a ghost. This is the war of the fox, not the lion. Du Guesclin's men are not the shimmering knights of the past. They are hard-bitten professionals, often former mercenaries he has bribed or bullied into service. They strike at night. Imagine an English baggage train lagging a mile behind the main column, the drivers dozing in the afternoon sun. Suddenly, from the tree line, a swarm of French cavalry bursts out, not charging with lances levelled for a fair fight, but slashing at the horses, cutting the wagon wheels, setting fire to the supplies, and vanishing back into the woods before the main English force can turn around. It is a war of 1,000 pinpricks. The English soldiers, hungry and paranoid, begin to sleep in their armour. They see French spies in every shadow. Their morale bleeds away, drop by drop, in the cold rain of a country that refuses to stand and fight. It is deeply frustrating for the chivalric mind. To the English nobility, this is cowardice. It is unknightly. They send taunting letters to Du Guesclin, challenging him to meet them in the open field for the love of God and the ladies. Du Guesclin likely reads these letters, chuckles, and throws them into the fire to warm his hands. He does not care about the ladies' opinion of his bravery. He cares about driving the English into the sea. One of his greatest talents is his understanding of the castle not as a home, but as a strategic chess piece. He realises that while he shouldn't fight the English army, he can take back the land they occupy one stone box at a time. He becomes a master of the surprise siege. He does not sit outside for months building trebuchets. He uses guile. He bribes a gatekeeper to leave a door unlocked. He has his men dress as washerwomen or woodcutters to infiltrate the courtyard before drawing their swords. In one famous story, perhaps embellished, but spiritually true to his character, he captures a castle by having his men pile bundles of wood against the gate and setting them on fire under the cover of darkness, smoking the defenders out like bees from a hive. It is practical, messy, and devastatingly effective. Historians still argue whether Du Guesclin was a military genius who foresaw modern guerrilla warfare, or simply a pragmatist who had no other choice given the depleted state of the French army. But the results speak for themselves. Between 1369 and Surineti, he claws back almost all the territory lost at the Treaty of Bretigny. The great English Empire in France, won with so much blood at Crécy and Poitiers, evaporates like morning mist. There is a softer side to this hog in armour, however. He is known for his immense loyalty to his men and his surprising kindness to the lower orders. Unlike many nobles who view peasants as cattle, Du Guesclin often pays for what his army eats, or at least he tries to, when the treasury allows. He understands that the war is won in the hearts of the common people, as much as on the battlefield. If the English are the locusts who eat the crops, he must be the gardener who protects the roots. There is a legend that on his deathbed he told his officers, "Remember that the poor, the widows, and the orphans are not your enemies. You carry arms only to defend them." Whether he actually said this is up for debate, but it cements his legacy as a different kind of hero, a people's constable. As we watch the map of France change colour, from the red of England back to the blue of France, we see the exhaustion of the English commanders. John of Gaunt's Great March of 1373 is a disaster. He loses half his army and almost all his horses without fighting a single major battle. His knights arrive in Bordeaux on foot, begging for bread, defeated not by the sword, but by the empty horizon. The fox of Brittany has outsmarted the lion. He has proven that patience is a weapon sharper than any lance, but time comes for everyone, even the fox. Du Guesclin dies in 1380, not in battle, but of illness during a siege, fittingly enough. He is buried in the royal basilica of Saint-Denis. Among the kings of France, the ugly boy who ate at the wrong table, now resting beside the monarchs he saved. The war enters a lull, a breathless pause as both sides mourn their great captains, for the Black Prince has died just a few years earlier. The generation of giants is passing. The stage is clearing for the next act, but the lesson has been learned. The age of chivalry is effectively dead, replaced by the age of strategy. The shadows of the forest lengthen, covering the tracks of the guerrilla fighters, and the wind whispers through the trees, telling a story of how a bad knight saved a kingdom by refusing to be a good one. Sleep now, knowing that sometimes the smartest way to win a fight is simply not to be there when the punch is thrown. Listen now to the sound of rain, not at the gentle nurturing shower of spring, but a relentless cold October deluge that has been falling for days, soaking into the deep, clay-rich soil of the Pas de Calais. It is the night of October 24th, 1415, and the world is wet, miserable, and smelling of wet wool and fear. We are in a small clearing between two dark woods, near the village of Azincourt, or as history will anglicise it, Agincourt. The English army, led by the young king Henry V, is trapped. They are a shadow of the force that landed in France months ago, ravaged by dysentery, the bloody flux, nor starving and exhausted from a march of over 200 miles in 17 days. They are coughing, shivering, and many have cut the seats out of their breeches to accommodate the sickness that plagues them. Across the muddy field, the French army is a galaxy of torchlight and laughter. They outnumber the English at least 5-1, perhaps more. The French camp is loud, with the sounds of confident men gambling for the ransoms they expect to collect the next day. They have already painted a cart to carry the captured English king to Paris. In the English camp there is silence. King Henry has ordered that any man who makes a noise will lose his horse or his right ear. It is a silence of prayer and confession, the silence of men who believe they are about to meet their Maker. But in this dark, wet silence, the weapon that will decide the battle is already at work. The mud. The sun rises on St. Crispin's Day, October 25th, revealing a field that is essentially a ploughed trap. The battlefield is a narrow corridor of open ground, hemmed in on both sides by dense woodland, the woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt. This geography is crucial. It means The massive French army cannot flank the tiny English force. They must come straight down the pipe. And the pipe is clogged. The ground, freshly turned for winter wheat and soaked by the autumn rains, has turned into a viscous, knee-deep quagmire of sticky clay. To walk in it is difficult. To run in it while wearing 60 pounds of plate armour is an act of folly. Henry draws his men up in a single thin line, 4 deep, with his archers on the flanks and in wedges between the men-at-arms. He plants sharp wooden stakes, 6-foot poles pointed at both ends, into the ground, angled toward the enemy. These are the chevaux de frise, a hedge of thorns designed to impale any horse foolish enough to charge. Then a strange thing happens. For hours, nothing moves. The French, perhaps remembering the lessons of the past, refuse to attack. They are content to wait and let the English starve. Henry knows he cannot wait. In a move of breathtaking audacity, he orders his exhausted, sick army to uproot their stakes and march forward, closing the distance to within extreme bowshot of the enemy. It is a moment of extreme vulnerability, but the French, sluggish and perhaps confused by this aggression from a dying animal, do not charge. The English replant their stakes, the archers embrace the earth, and the king gives the signal. Now strike! The first volley of arrows flies, provoking the French into action. The French cavalry charges, but the mud grips their horses' hooves like wet cement. They cannot build speed. When they reach the English stakes, the horses shy away or are impaled, throwing their riders into the muck. The surviving horses turn and gallop back, directly into the advancing lines of their own infantry. It is a collision of panic and steel. The main body of the French army, the thousands of dismounted men-at-arms, begins to trudge forward. But the field narrows as they approach the English line, acting like a funnel. The men in the back, eager to get to the fight, push forward, crushing the men in the front so tightly together that they cannot lift their arms to swing their weapons. They are not fighting the English yet, they are fighting the crush. And all the while, the arrow storm continues. The English archers are firing bodkin points that hammer into the helmets and breastplates of the French. Even if the armour holds, the kinetic energy knocks men backward into the mud. And once a man in full plate falls in this clay, he cannot get up. He is trampled by his comrades, pressed into the suffocating earth. When the two lines finally meet, it is not a fencing match. It is a slaughter in a mosh pit. The English men-at-arms, fighting in lighter armour or without leg plates because of the long march, are more agile. They step back, stab, and step back again. The archers, running out of arrows, drop their bows and draw swords, axes, and heavy lead mauls, the hammers used to drive the stakes. These light, unarmoured men swarm over the immobilized French knights, like terriers attacking trapped bulls. They strike at the visors, the armpits, the groins, the weak points of the white harness. The French are falling in heaps, piles of dead and living men stacking up as high as a man's head. It is a horrific, suffocating wall of humanity. Men die not from sword wounds, but from drowning in the mud or being crushed by the weight of their own friends. The battlefield becomes a graveyard of the French aristocracy. The Constable of France, the Admiral, Dukes, and Counts, they all vanish into the mire. In the middle of this chaos, a dark shadow passes over the king's conscience. A rumour spreads that a fresh French force is attacking the English baggage train in the rear. Henry, fearing that his small army will be overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners they have taken, prisoners who are still armed and could turn on their captors, gives a brutal order: kill the prisoners. The knights refuse, for it goes against every code of chivalry and profit they know. So, Henry orders a squad of 200 archers to do the work. It is a cold, calculated massacre, a stain on the victory that historians still debate with hushed tones. Was it a war crime or a desperate necessity of survival? The killing stops only when Henry realizes the attack on the rear is just a raid by local peasants stealing silverware. But the deed is done. The field is silent again, save for the groans of the wounded and the sucking sound of the mud releasing its grip. As the early winter dusk settles over the field of Agincourt, the scale of the devastation is hard to comprehend. The English have lost perhaps a few hundred men, including the Duke of York, who was not slain by a sword, but reportedly died of heat exhaustion and suffocation under the pile of bodies. The French have lost thousands, a generation of leaders wiped out in a single afternoon. The English soldiers, too tired to celebrate, strip the armour from the dead, walking carefully over the sea of steel and mud. They find the French herald, Montjoy, and King Henry asks him the name of the castle that stands nearby. Agincourt, the herald replies. Then, says the king, let this battle be known as the Battle of Agincourt. It is the zenith of the English longbow, the moment when the wood of the yew defeated the steel of the furnace for the last definitive time. But it is also a victory of the earth itself, the cold, wet clay of France that swallowed the pride of its own defenders. The army marches away, leaving the dead to the crows and the silence, proving that in war, the ground you stand on is just as deadly as the weapon you hold. Lower your gaze now, away from the fluttering banners and the sun-glinting crests of the high nobility, down to the muddy level of the common boot. We are stepping into the ranks of the forgotten, the men who do not have coats of arms, but who have calloused hands and strong backs. The infantry. While the archer and the knight dominate the songs of the era, the backbone of the army, the solid wall that allows the archer to shoot and the knight to rest, is the man-at-arms wielding a polearm. In the English army, this man carries a weapon that is terrifyingly humble, the bill. To understand the bill, you do not need to visit a royal armoury, you need to visit a medieval garden. For centuries, the billhook was, and still is, a tool for pruning apple trees and hacking back overgrown hedgerows. It is a curved, heavy knife on a short handle, but put that iron head on a 6-foot shaft of ash, add a top spike for thrusting and a rear spike for piercing, and you have the black bill, a weapon of grotesque efficiency. It is the ultimate example of the medieval talent for turning a ploughshare into a sword. The soldier looking at a French knight does not see a noble warrior. He sees a stubborn, metal-plated bush that needs to be trimmed. The genius of the bill lies in its versatility. It is the Swiss Army knife of the 100 Years' War. With the forward curving blade, the billman can chop down with the force of an axe, cleaving through helmets and shoulder plates. With the top spike, he can thrust at the face or throat of a charging enemy. But it is the hook that is the true nightmare. In the chaos of a melee, a billman can reach out, hook the curved blade around a knight's leg, neck, or reins, and drag him violently to the ground. Once a knight is on his back in the mud, he is no longer a tank, he is a turtle, vulnerable and heavy. The billman's job is to shuck the knight like an oyster. It is a style of fighting that lacks all elegance. It is wrestling with knives, a gritty, sweating, cursing struggle, where leverage matters more than fencing. Historians often point out that while the sword is the symbol of the war, the polearm was the actual tool of the trade. If the sword is the fighter jet, the bill is the bulldozer. Across the channel, and indeed among the dismounted knights of both sides, another weapon reigns supreme, the poleaxe. If the bill is the weapon of the commoner, the poleaxe is the weapon of the professional killer. It is a brutal masterpiece of design, usually featuring a heavy axe blade or hammerhead on one side, a jagged spike on the other, and a long steel point at the top, all mounted on a shaft reinforced with metal strips called languettes so it cannot be cut in two. This is the can opener designed specifically to defeat the white harness we saw being forged in Milan. A sword, no matter how sharp, will often glance off the rounded surfaces of plate armour. But a poleaxe, swung with both hands, like a woodcutter felling an oak, delivers a percussive shock that travels through the steel and shatters the bone beneath. A blow to the helmet might not cut the metal, but it will concuss the man inside, leaving him reeling and blind. The combat of the poleaxe is rhythmic and heavy. It is the sound of a sledgehammer hitting a dumpster. In the fencing manuals of the time, yes, there were manuals, like those of the mysterious master Fiore de Liberi. Men are taught to use the poleaxe to hook, trip, disarm and crush. It is a martial art of levers and fulcrums, where the goal is to put the opponent on the ground and keep him there. There is a grim intimacy to this kind of fighting. In the press of the battle, when the lines are locked together like the teeth of a comb, there is no room for wide swings. The soldiers shortened their grip, using the butt of the weapon to punch and the shaft to block. And when the enemy falls, then comes the misericorde, or the dagger of mercy. It is a long, thin, needle-like blade carried at the belt of almost every soldier. Its name is a dark euphemism. It is used to grant the mercy of a quick death to a knight who is too wounded to be ransomed. The blade is designed to slip through the tiny gaps in the armour, through the eye slit of the visor, under the armpit, or behind the knee. It is the final, quiet punctuation mark to the loud sentence of the battle. It reminds us that for all the romance of chivalry, the reality of the 100 Years' War often ended in the mud, with a knife in the dark. Yet, we must not imagine these infantrymen as mindless thugs. They are highly disciplined professionals. They fight in formation, standing shoulder to shoulder, creating a hedgehog of points that can stop a cavalry charge dead in its tracks. A horse, no matter how well trained, will rarely charge into a solid wall of sharp sticks. This discipline is the antidote to the individualism of the early feudal age. A billman does not need to be a hero. He just needs to stay in line. If he steps out to seek personal glory, he creates a gap that can kill his friends. Thus the weapon shapes the mindset, the bill teaches cooperation, while the lance taught ego. We also see the rise of other specialised tools like the maul, a giant lead hammer used by archers who, contrary to popular belief, were often big, burly men, not wispy elves. At Agincourt, it was these mauls that dented the finest French armour, proving that sometimes simple physics beats expensive metallurgy. There is a sensory texture to this infantry war that is often lost. It is the smell of linseed oil on the wood of the shafts, the rough texture of the leather grip, the weight of the iron head balancing in the hand. It is the sound of thousands of boots stamping in unison, a low thunder that vibrates in the chest. These men, the billmen and the halberdiers, are the ancestors of the modern infantry squad. They represent the democratization of the battlefield, the idea that a carpenter with a modified pruning hook is the equal of a lord with a pedigree. As the 15th century progresses, their importance only grows. The knight is slowly being crowded out, not just by the arrow, but by the forest of poles that rises to meet him. The individual warrior is disappearing into the machine, but even as the polearm reaches its peak, a new smell is drifting across the battlefield, a scent sharper than sweat, more acrid than wood smoke. It is the sulphurous stench of the devil's powder. The infantryman, gripping his ashwood staff, looks across the field and sees a puff of white smoke, followed by a roar that sounds like the earth splitting open. He does not know it yet, but the age of muscle is ending. The bill and the poleaxe are about to be challenged by a force that requires no strength to wield, only a spark to ignite. The dragon has woken up, and its breath is going to burn the medieval world to ash. Sleep now in the quiet confidence that the strongest walls are those built of friendship and discipline, and that even the humblest tool can change the course of history if held by a steady hand. The sharp, metallic ring of the billhook and the pollux fades now, swallowed by a new and heavy silence, a silence that is merely the deep breath before a roar. We are standing on the edge of a technological precipice, looking down into a smoky, sulphurous pit where the rules of warfare are being rewritten by chemistry rather than chivalry. It is the early 15th century, though the seeds were sown earlier, and the air of the battlefield carries a new, distinctive scent. It is the stink of hell, a pungent, stinging aroma of rotten eggs and burnt charcoal that clings to the hair and clothes of a new breed of soldier, the gunner. We are witnessing the birth of the dragon, the arrival of gunpowder artillery. To the modern ear, a cannon is a precise mechanical thing. But to the soldier of the 100 Years' War, encountering a cannon or a bombard for the first time is a confrontation with the dark and terrifying magic. These early weapons are not the sleek cast bronze tubes of later centuries. They are ugly iron monsters, often built like barrels, hence the term barrel, constructed from long staves of wrought iron, welded together and bound with red-hot iron hoops. They look less like weapons and more like industrial cauldrons, squat and ominous, sitting in the mud on wooden sleds, lacking even the wheels that would later give them mobility. They are beasts of burden, dragged by teams of 20 or 30 oxen, moving at a glacial pace, sinking into the soft French roads. The food for these dragons is a powder that is equal parts science and alchemy. It requires 3 ingredients mixed in a secret ratio that gunners guard with their lives: charcoal, ground from the willow tree; sulphur, the yellow brimstone mined from the earth; and the most precious and repulsive ingredient of all, saltpeter. Saltpeter, or potassium nitrate, is the oxidizer, the breath that makes the fire burn instantly. In this era, it is not mined. It is harvested. It forms as white, crusty crystals on the walls of stables, cellars, and latrines, places where organic waste decays. There is a profound dark irony here that historians often note with a dry smile. The material used to blast apart the shimmering, noble walls of castles is scraped from the dampest, foulest corners of the barnyard. The saltpeter men who collect it are granted royal warrants to dig up floors in private homes, hated figures who literally sift through the muck of society to fuel the wars of kings. When mixed, this serpentine powder is unstable and dangerous. It absorbs water from the air, turning into a useless black sludge, or separates in the barrel during transport, with the heavy sulphur sinking to the bottom. To fix this, gunners must mix the powder on-site, a perilous task performed near open flames, leading to many battles ending before they begin because the artillery tent has suddenly ceased to exist. On the battlefield, these weapons are weapons of psychological terror more than physical destruction. The rebow, or organ gun, is a favourite of the time, a cart mounted with several small barrels, designed to fire a volley of lead shot like a primitive machine gun. But the reliability is, to put it mildly, questionable. Firing a cannon is a slow, ritualistic dance with death. The gunner, who considers himself a craftsman superior to the common archer, pours the powder down the throat of the beast, wadding it with straw or sheepskin. Then comes the projectile. In the early days, these are not iron cannonballs but gunstones, spheres laboriously carved from sandstone or limestone by masons. If the stone is too small, the gas escapes and the shot dribbles out. If it is too big, the barrel bursts, killing the crew instantly. Gunners are often depicted in manuscripts standing well back, lighting the fuse with a long linstock murmuring a prayer to Saint Barbara, the patron saint of those who work with explosives and face sudden death. It is said that a good gunner is easy to identify because he still has all his fingers. When the gun finally fires, the result is less a bang and more a cataclysms. A flash of blinding light, a cloud of thick white smoke that obscures the entire position, and a concussive roar that knocks men flat. For horses, creatures of instinct, this thunder is apocalyptic. We have accounts of cavalry charges dissolving simply because the horses heard the boom and refused to advance, bolting in terror from the invisible dragon. There is a widespread belief among soldiers that the wind of the ball, the air pressure wave created by the passing shot, is poisonous or forceful enough to kill a man without even touching him. Soldiers speak of men dropping dead with no mark on them, their souls simply shaken loose by the noise. While medically dubious, it speaks to the sheer alien trauma of high explosives entering a world of swords. Scholars still debate the true effectiveness of these early guns in open battle. Many argue that they were actually less effective than a good trebuchet. They were inaccurate, slow, firing perhaps once an hour, and prone to exploding. A sudden rain shower could render an entire artillery train useless. However, their true power lies in the siege. The high stone walls of medieval castles were designed to resist gravity, ladders and towers, and kinetic impact, rams and stones, but a gunstone, fired flat and fast, hits with a concentrated energy that shatters masonry. It does not just knock a piece off, it vibrates the entire structure. We see the beginning of the end for the tall, majestic curtain walls of the past. Castles begin to feel obsolete. A king can no longer hide behind high towers if his enemy can bring a bombard that coughs iron and fire. The siege of Harfleur in 1415 gives us a glimpse of this transition. King Henry IV brings his great guns with names like the King's Daughter and the Messenger. They pound the walls day and night. The sound prevents the defenders from sleeping, a form of torture by noise. The walls crumble not in months, but in days. Yet even here, the guns are clumsy. During the siege, several of Henry's cannons burst, killing his own master gunners. It is a technology in its angry adolescence, powerful but unruly, hurting its user as often as its target. There is a tragic beauty to the gunner's craft. He is a mathematician in a world of brutes, calculating elevation and powder charges, yet he is covered in soot, deafened by his own trade, and shunned by the knights who view his weapon as cowardly. It is a great shame, one chronicler writes, that a brave man should be killed by a knave he cannot see. The gun removes the personal element of combat. There is no eye contact, no clash of wills, just a lit fuse and a cloud of smoke. As the smoke clears from the field, drifting low over the wet grass, we see that the age of the hero is fading. The dragon has arrived, and it does not care about your coat of arms or your skill with a lance. It cares only for the ratio of saltpeter to charcoal. The noise of the guns settles into a ringing in your ears, a persistent hum that warns of the future. But for now, amidst the smoke and the ruin, France is on its knees, battered by English arrows and English iron. The Dauphin is disinherited, the crown is in peril, and the people are losing hope. They need something more than a new weapon. They need a miracle. And in the quiet village of Domremy, far from the thunder of the guns, a young girl is listening to a different kind of voice, not the roar of powder, but the whisper of angels. The sulphur smoke of the cannons clears, revealing not a landscape of iron and fire, but a quiet, dew-drenched garden in the village of Domremy. It is 1425, and the air is filled with the innocent sound of church bells and the rustling of leaves. Here, amidst the chaos of a kingdom that has effectively ceased to exist, a 13-year-old girl named Joanne is on her knees in the grass. She is not a soldier. She cannot read or write. She has never held a sword or seen a map. Yet, she is about to become the most potent weapon in the French arsenal, a force more destructive to the English cause than any bombard or battalion. She hears voices, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, whispering to her in the wind, telling her a truth that seems impossible, that she, a peasant girl who spins wool, will raise the siege of Orléans and crown the Dauphin as King of France. To the modern mind, this is a psychological phenomenon. To the medieval mind, it is a divine mandate. And in the context of the 100 Years' War, it is the introduction of a new tactical element, absolute fanatical morale. France does not lack soldiers, it lacks the will to fight. The French army is a beaten dog, cowering after decades of defeat, convinced that God is an Englishman. Joan does not bring a new bow or a new tactic. She brings the conviction that the script can be rewritten. Fast forward to 1429. Imagine the scene at the court of Chinon. The Dauphin, Charles VII, is a man paralysed by indecision, ruling a shrinking shadow of a country. Joan arrives dressed in men's clothes, a scandal in itself. She identifies the king hiding in a crowd of courtiers, a moment of mystical theatre that convinces him to listen. But the true transformation happens in the camp. Joan is given a suit of white armour, custom-made to fit her small frame, a gleaming symbol of purity in a war of filth. She refuses a sword at first, preferring to carry her standard, a banner of white linen embroidered with lilies and the words Jesus Maria. She rides into the midst of the French army, a rough collection of mercenaries, hardened killers, and cynics who have seen everything, and she changes them. She bans swearing, a vice as natural to soldiers as breathing, and chases away the camp followers and prostitutes. Astonishingly, these rough men listen. The Maid of Orléans becomes a mascot, a living reliquary. They stop fighting for a paycheck and start fighting for a saint. It is a masterclass in psychological warfare. She turns a band of losers into a crusade. Her military strategy is simple, bordering on reckless. The professional commanders, like the bastard of Orléans, Jean de Dunois, favour caution, skirmishing and starving the English out. Joan favours the charge. She does not understand the nuance of the standoff. She only understands that the English are in France, and they should not be. At the siege of Orléans, the English have surrounded the city with a series of forts or bastilles. The French commanders want to attack the smaller, weaker ones. Joan points her banner at the strongest one, the fortress of Les Tourelles, and says, "Go there." She leads from the front, not swinging a sword to kill. She famously said she never killed a man, but standing in the arrow storm, urging the men forward. It is a dangerous place to be. During the assault, an English arrow strikes her. It plunges into her shoulder between the neck and the chest armour. She falls. The English cheer from the walls. The witch is dead. The spell is broken. But Joan is carried to the rear. She weeps with pain, a reminder that she is just a teenager, not a spirit. But then, in a moment that solidifies her legend, she pulls the arrow out with her own hand, has the wound dressed with olive oil and bacon fat, and demands to go back to the wall. When the English see the dead witch rise from the grass and lift her banner again, terror seizes them. They are no longer fighting a girl, they are fighting something that cannot be killed. The French, energized by this miracle, swarm the walls. The fort falls. The siege is broken. Historians still argue about Joan's actual tactical contribution. Was she a military genius or just a morale officer? The consensus leans toward the idea that she provided the shock that the cautious French professionals needed. She forced them to be aggressive. She possessed an uncanny ability to place artillery. The The Duke of Alençon praised her eye for positioning cannons, suggesting that perhaps she had a savant-like grasp of the geometry of war. But her greatest weapon was the shattering of the English myth of invincibility. For nearly a century, the English believed God was on their side. Joan stole that certainty. If God was speaking to a French peasant girl, then the English were not righteous conquerors, they were trespassers. This doubt is as deadly as the plague. The English soldiers begin to desert. They are terrified of the witch of the Armagnacs. The tragedy of Joan is that her utility as a weapon eventually outstrips her value as a person. She is captured, sold to the English, and put on trial not for war crimes, but for heresy and wearing men's clothes. It is a political show trial designed to discredit the king she crowned. If she is a witch, then Charles VII is a king made by the devil. She burns at the stake in Rouen in 1431, asking for a cross to be held before her eyes as the flames rise. The English throw her ashes into the Seine, so no relics can be kept. But they have made a fatal error. They have turned a commander into a martyr. You can defeat an army, but you cannot defeat a ghost. The flames of Rouen do not end the war. They ignite a slow burning nationalism in the French heart. The soldiers who watched her die and the soldiers who followed her now fight with a grim, holy purpose. The maid is gone, but the fire she lit burns in the touch holes of the French cannons that are slowly, methodically wheeling toward the final confrontations. The banner has fallen, but the army marches on, no longer a feudal levy, but a nation in arms, moving toward the thunder that waits at Castillon. The spiritual fire of the maid fades into the pages of legend, replaced now by a heat that is entirely physical and oppressive. It is July 17th, 1453, and the sun is beating down on the vineyards of Gascony near the town of Castillon. The air is thick, humid, and buzzing with the lazy drone of cicadas. We are standing at the very end of the road, the final punctuation mark of the 100 Years' War. But looking at the two commanders preparing for this day, we see a clash not just of nations, but of eras. On one side, riding for the English, is John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury. He is over 80 years old, a staggering age for a soldier in this time, known as the English Achilles. He is a living monument to the war, a man who remembers Agincourt, who fought Joan of Arc, who has spent his entire life in the saddle. He is the embodiment of the chivalric ideal, brave, aggressive, and fiercely proud. He rides into battle today, not in armour, having sworn an oath to a previous captor that he would not wear mail against the King of France, but in a crimson velvet surcoat, a splash of blood red against the green fields. He believes in the shock of the charge, the strength of the arm, the old way. On the other side, waiting behind a line of hastily dug earthworks, is a man who looks nothing like a hero. Jean Bureau is not a duke or a count. He is a lawyer, a bureaucrat, a man of ledgers and ink. He is the master of the French artillery, a title that barely existed when the war began. He does not believe in personal glory, he believes in geometry. He has not arranged his men in a line to duel, he has built a killing zone. His army is entrenched behind a ditch and a palisade, but the true defence is the battery of 300 cannons, handguns, rebolts, and heavy bombards, arranged wheel to wheel, pointing outward, like the quills of a deadly porcupine. It is the first time in history that a field army has made artillery its primary arm. Bureau is not planning a battle. He is planning an industrial accident for anyone foolish enough to approach. The tragedy of Castillon begins, as so many tragedies do, with a misunderstanding. Talbot, arriving with his vanguard of eager Anglo-Gascon troops, captures a small French outpost at a priory. His blood is up. He is told by scouts, or perhaps by terrified locals, that the French army is retreating, that clouds of dust are rising from their camp. In reality, the dust is merely the French camp followers moving the baggage horses. But Talbot, the old lion, smells weakness. He fears the enemy is escaping his grasp. Against the advice of his more cautious captains, who beg him to wait for the rest of his army and his own artillery to catch up, he orders the attack. "I will hang you all if you do not follow me," he might have shouted, his voice cracking with the impatience of a man who has fought too many battles to wait for the perfect moment. He orders his men to dismount and storm the French camp. Getty Images. The English force rushes forward, shouting their war cries, expecting to chase a fleeing rabble. Instead, they run straight into the mouth of the dragon. As they emerge from the cover of the priory and cross the open ground toward the French earthworks, Jean Bureau gives the signal. It is not a singular boom, but a ripple of thunder that tears the sky apart. 300 guns fire in a rolling volley. The effect is catastrophic. At Crécy and Agincourt, the arrow storm was a whisper of death. At Castillon, the artillery storm is a shout. The iron shot tears through the English ranks, cutting bloody lanes through the mass of soldiers. Men are not just killed, they are erased. The smoke from the black powder billows out, a thick, sulphurous fog that blinds the attackers, turning the bright summer day into a grey hell. Yet the English are stubborn. They are the sons of the victors of Poitiers, and they do not break easily. They push through the smoke, climbing over the bodies of their comrades reaching the ditch. They try to scale the earthworks, hacking at the wooden palisades with their axes. But they are met by a wall of crossbow fire and the point-blank discharge of hand cannons. It is a massacre. Talbot, the old warrior in his velvet coat, rides amidst the carnage, urging his men on, a tragic anachronism, refusing to accept that the world has changed. He is the knight fighting the machine. But the machine has no sense of honour. A cannonball, or perhaps a culverin shot, strikes his horse. The beast falls, pinning the 80-year-old earl beneath its weight. He lies there, trapped in the mud and the blood, unable to rise. The battle ends, not with a final duel, but with a swarm. The French, seeing the English broken by the guns, charge out from their defences. A French archer, a man named Michel Pérounin, finds the great John Talbot pinned under his horse. There is no request for surrender, no polite exchange of ransoms. Pérounin raises his axe and brings it down. The English Achilles is dead. With him dies the spirit of the English army in France. The survivors flee, chased by the French cavalry. But the pursuit is almost an afterthought. The work was done by the powder. Historians often point to Castillon as the true end of the Middle Ages in a military sense. It proved, finally and brutally, that chivalry could not survive in the face of concentrated firepower. The knight, who had dominated the battlefield for 500 years, had been rendered obsolete by a lawyer with a chemistry set. The English hold on Gascony, which had lasted for 3 centuries, collapses in an afternoon. Bordeaux surrenders soon after. There is no treaty signed immediately, no grand ceremony to mark the end of the war. The English simply go home, taking their longbows and their memories with them, leaving behind a France that is scarred, united, and armed with the weapons of the future. As the smoke clears over the Dordogne River, a profound silence falls. The roar of the 300 guns echoes into history, a sound that signals the birth of the modern nation-state. Kings can no longer rely on feudal levies. They need taxes to buy cannons, and they need professional engineers to run them. The romance of the lone warrior is replaced by the cold efficiency of the battery. We leave the field of Castillon in the twilight, where the only sound is the groaning of the wounded and the distant rhythmic chanting of the French priests burying the dead. The 100 Years' War is over. The bow is unstrung. The sword is sheathed, and in the distance, the first stars of the Renaissance are beginning to blink on. looking down on a world that has been forged in fire and is now cooling into a new, harder shape. The roar of the guns at Castillon fades into the distance, and we find ourselves now in a quiet, orderly chamber in the royal palace of France. The year is the mid-1440s, slightly rewinding the clock to see the machinery that made the victory possible, and then moving forward to see its legacy. King Charles VII, once the indecisive Dauphin who needed a teenage mystic to tell him he was king, has grown into a shrewd, calculating monarch known as the well-served. He sits at a table covered in parchment, but these are not poems or prayers, they are tax ledgers. He looks out the window at a kingdom that has been ravaged by a century of war, by wolves both animal and human. He knows that the true enemy of France is not just the English, but the chaos of his own military system. The feudal levy is too slow, the mercenaries are too dangerous. When the war pauses, the mercenaries eat the country alive. Charles decides to do something radical, something that will effectively end the Middle Ages politically, just as the canon ended it militarily. He decides to monopolize violence. In 1445, Charles issues the Ordonnance of Luppy-le-Château. With a stroke of a quill, he creates the Compagnie d'Ordonnance du Roi, the companies of the King's Ordinance. This is the birth of the first standing army in Europe since the fall of Rome. No longer will soldiers be disbanded at the end of a campaign to roam the woods as brigands. Now they will remain soldiers year-round, paid a regular wage from the royal treasury, housed in garrison towns, and subject to strict military law. It sounds bureaucratic, but it is revolutionary. It transforms the soldier from a seasonal labourer into a state employee. Imagine the shock for a rough Gascon mercenary captain. He is told that he can no longer pillage villages for his pay. Instead, he must submit to inspections. He must keep his armour clean. He must not swear too much. He must protect the civilians he used to rob. In exchange, he gets something he has never had, job security. The king selects the best captains, the most vicious and effective leaders of the free companies, and offers them commissions. The rest, the rabble, the undisciplined, the cruel, are told to disperse or face the gallows. It is a great sifting of the warrior class. The wolves are put in collars and turned into sheepdogs. The structure of this new army is precise. It is organized into lances. A lance is not just a weapon, it is a tactical unit of 6 men, 1 man at arms, a heavy cavalryman in full plate, his squire, a page, 2 archers, and a coutelier, a swordsman armed with a knife or short sword. It is a combined arms team in miniature. 100 of these lancers make a company. The king raises 20 companies, creating a permanent force of cavalry and mounted infantry that answers only to him, not to the local dukes. This breaks the power of the feudal nobility forever. A duke can no longer threaten the king with his private army, because the king's army is professional paid and significantly larger. This professionalism brings a new aesthetic to war. Uniforms begin to appear, not the matching camouflage of today, but the wearing of the king's colours, the white cross of France stitched onto surcoats. There is a sense of esprit de corps that goes beyond loyalty to a local lord. These men are gendarmes, literally men of arms, a term that will eventually evolve into the police force of modern France. They train constantly. The archers practice their aim. The knights practice formation riding. The chaotic surging mobs of the past are replaced by grid-like discipline. This shift also changes the weapons. Because the king is paying, he demands standardization. The armour becomes more uniform, produced in bulk by royal armories. The artillery, under the genius of the Bureau brothers, becomes a separate, highly technical branch of the service, with its own logistical train of wagons, powder mills, and gun founders. War is becoming a science. It is being removed from the hands of the poets and placed into the hands of the engineers and the accountants. But there is a human cost to this order. The romance of the knight-errant, the wandering hero seeking adventure, is dead. There is no place for a Lancelot in a compagnie d'ordonnance. You cannot ride off to rescue a damsel if you are scheduled for guard duty at the Tuesday morning muster. The individual is subsumed by the unit. The hero is replaced by the officer. The definition of bravery shifts from reckless personal combat to steady, disciplined obedience. As we watch a company of these new gendarmes ride through a French village in the late 1450s, we notice something profound. The peasants do not run away. They do not hide their daughters or bury their grain. They stand and watch, perhaps even cheer. For the first time in 4 generations, the arrival of soldiers does not mean doom. It means protection. The king's peace has finally arrived, enforced by men who are paid to keep it. The 100 Years' War has burned away the fat of the feudal world, leaving behind the hard muscle of the modern state. The long nightmare of the chevauché is over. The roads are safe again. The silence of the forest is no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of peace. The sun sets on the age of the mercenary, and the night watchman calls out that all is well, his voice echoing in a kingdom that is, at long last, waking up from a century of bad dreams. Stand now on the white cliffs of Dover, looking out over the grey churning waters of the narrow sea one last time. It is the late 1450s, and the horizon is empty. For over a century, this stretch of water was a highway for ships laden with archers, horses, and ambition, a busy artery feeding the heart of a conflict that seemed eternal. Now, the ships are few, carrying only wool and wine, the mundane commerce of a world returning to the business of living. The great storm has passed, leaving behind a silence that feels heavy and strange. The English have been driven from the continent, holding only the port of Calais, a tiny, stubborn toehold that they will cling to for another century, a sentimental souvenir of an empire that once stretched to the Pyrenees. But the dream of a dual monarchy, of a Plantagenet king sitting on the throne of Paris, has evaporated like mist in the morning sun. The two nations, having spent 100 years trying to merge through blood and marriage, have instead been hammered into 2 distinct, hardened shapes, separated by the sea and by a newfound sense of self. In England, the return of the soldiers brings not peace, but a different kind of chaos. The dogs of war have come home, and they are hungry. Thousands of archers and men-at-arms, addicted to the plunder and adrenaline of France, find the quiet English countryside stifling. The great nobles, the Dukes of York and Somerset, who learned the art of factionalism and private warfare in the campaigns of Normandy, now turn their eyes and their armies on each other. The loss of the French territories is a national trauma, a humiliation that destabilises the crown of Henry VI, the gentle, mentally fragile son of the hero of Agincourt. The Wars of the Roses are about to begin. A civil war that is essentially the 100 Years' War cannibalising itself. The English will spend the next 30 years killing each other with the same longbows and bills they used to kill the French, a grim historical irony that suggests violence is energy. It is never destroyed, only transferred, yet amidst this new strife, a cultural victory has been won. Before the war, the English court spoke French, the laws were in French, the soul of the aristocracy was continental. Now, English is the language of power. The war has severed the umbilical cord. The loss of France forces England to become England, an island nation, looking outward to the sea, forging an identity based on stubborn independence and the myth of the yeoman archer. Across the water, France has also been transformed. The Valois monarchy, which began the war weak and decentralised, besieged by its own dukes, has emerged as the most powerful centralised state in Christendom. King Charles VII and his successor, Louis the Benedictine, the Universal Spider, rule over a unified realm. The great duchies of Burgundy and Brittany are being slowly absorbed into the royal web. The sacred kingdom has been sanctified by the blood of martyrs, like Joan and the iron of the new artillery. The French people, once a patchwork of Gascons, Normans and Picards, have discovered a common French identity, forged in the fires of English occupation. They have learned that they belong to a nation, not just a lord. The war has been a cruel teacher, but it has taught them the value of unity. The landscape itself begins to heal. The forests which had overgrown the farmland during the decades of anarchy are cleared again. The villages are rebuilt, this time in stone. The population, decimated by plague and sword, begins the slow, steady climb of recovery. The technology of the war now begins its slow migration from the battlefield to the museum. The longbow, the weapon that defined the century, does not disappear overnight. It remains the national weapon of England for another 150 years, loved and practiced with nostalgic fervour, but its dominance is over. The handgun and the arquebus are rising. They are clumsy and slow, but they are the future. The training of a lifetime required for the bow cannot compete with the training of a week required for the gun. The song of the yew is fading, replaced by the crack of powder. Similarly, the white harness of the knight enters its twilight. It becomes more elaborate, more decorative, evolving into the fluted Maximilian armour of the Renaissance, beautiful but increasingly symbolic. Men still wear it, but they know deep down that a lead ball can punch through the finest Milanese steel as if it were parchment. The age of the warrior athlete, the man whose personal strength and skill determined the fate of nations, is yielding to the age of the soldier technician, a cog in a machine of volley fire and mathematical sieges. Historians often engage in a pedantic but fascinating debate about when the war actually ended. Was it 1453 at Castillon, or was it 1475 with the Treaty of Picquigny, when Edward IV of England took a bribe to go home, or was it not until 1802, when George III finally dropped King of France from his official title? And indeed, the very name the 100 Years' War is a deception. It was not a phrase used by the people who fought it. It was coined by historians in the 19th century to impose order on a chaotic series of struggles. To the men and women who lived through it, it was simply the war, a permanent condition of life, like the weather or the seasons. It was the backdrop to every harvest, every birth, and every death for 5 generations. As we step back from the cliff edge, leaving the 15th century behind, we are left with the human residue of the conflict. We think of the archer rubbing beeswax into his bowstring, the knight polishing his visor, the mother hiding her grain, and the gunner mixing his powder. They are all gone now, their bones dust in the soil of Aquitaine and Normandy. But their legacy remains in the borders of Europe, in the language we speak, and in the very way we think about war and nations. The 100 Years' War was the crucible of the modern world. It began with knights and castles, and it ended with standing armies and artillery. It began with chivalry, and it ended with strategy. It was a bridge of swords that Europe walked across to reach the Renaissance. The sun sets now, finally and truly, on the Middle Ages. The last banner is furled, the last trumpet note dies away, and the channel settles into a rhythm of waves that wash against the shores of 2 nations that have finally agreed to be neighbours rather than masters. The long bloody lullaby is over. Now, let the camera of your mind pull back, further and further, until the armies are just specks of colour on a map, and then further still, until the map dissolves into the turning globe. The fires of the chevauchée have burned out, the mud of Agincourt has dried and been covered by 600 years of wildflowers. The castles that once frowned over the valleys are now peaceful ruins, their broken walls softened by moss and ivy, playground for children and homes for nesting birds. The shouts of the captains and the screams of the horses have been absorbed by the wind, replaced by the quiet hum of the modern world. Release the tension from your own shoulders. Feel the weight of the armour, the worries of your day, the battles you have fought. Slide off you, piece by heavy piece. Unbuckle the greaves, unlatch the breastplate, and let them fall to the floor with a silent thud, leaving you light and free. You are no longer on the march. You are safe in your own keep, behind walls that no siege can breach, in a warmth that no winter can touch. The history remains true and deep, but the pain of it has passed into story. The knights and the archers, the kings and the peasant girls, they are all at rest now, sleeping in the quiet archives of time. They have done their work, so you can rest. The darkness around you is not the terrifying dark of the medieval forest, but the comforting velvet wrap of the night. Let the silence of the centuries settle over you like a soft, heavy quilt. The war is over, the peace is here. Sweet dreams.